Hello, everybody. This is NGO Soul and Strategy, and welcome. We are diving deep into what truly shapes the effectiveness and what I call the soul, or should I say the identity, the DNA of international NGOs, as well as nonprofits. We look at organizational culture, relevance, leadership, change management, and governance. Today, we're joined by Andrew Henck, a scholar practitioner based in the UK in London, whose recent PhD dissertation, I'm talking about 2 years ago, is called Safeguarding from Scrutiny Toward a Critical Consciousness of Organizational Culture in Humanitarian NGOs. And listeners, don't worry, we're not going to engage in a long and boring academic discussion. We're going to make it practical right away. Andrew's dissertation offers a provocative and timely exploration of how the sector responds to crises of wrongdoing, particularly, and I want to emphasize this, through the lens of culture. And full disclosure, Andrew and I met because Andrew's advisor during his dissertation studies is a close collaborator, Hans-Peter Schmitz. We will not so much talk about the topic of safeguarding per se, which in the current kind of setting in which we all are in 2025, while still being very, very relevant, feels like a little bit out of date. We want to just set the scene on safeguarding in the beginning, but we will particularly focus on how organizational culture in NGOs and nonprofits should be understood, how it shows up practically, how culture relates to also to power structures and leadership mindsets. And we may talk briefly about how government regulatory agencies need to adjust their understanding of culture. Culture is one of my all-time favorite topics to work on with clients, so I'm excited about learning from Andrew today. And with that, Andrew, welcome.
Thank you so much, Tosca. Good to be with you.
You and I have kind of exchanged notes about culture for a long time, and I've always seen you as somebody who I need to learn from. So here we go. Andrew is a lecturer, in other words, an assistant professor at Glasgow Caledonian University. As I said, he's based in London. He also, in his past and current, I believe, he's a career and leadership coach. He's an organizational development consultant. He has a specialty, a methodology called Lego, a serious play, which I wish we had time for, but we don't. He obtained his PhD at the University of San Diego in the USA. He used to work for World Vision for their people and culture leadership in Papua New Guinea. He was a professional development manager at one point for World Vision, so he clearly and squarely comes from practice. So, Andrew, first question, and an obvious one. Tell us a bit more about the topic of your dissertation and why that topic.
Thank you, Tosca, and thank you again for the invitation. Such a treat to be in conversation with you after all of these years
I
of
know.
following each other. I have long been fascinated by organizational life, how they work at the systems level, more times than not, how they don't work, and how we can learn from those moments. I have been very much so a geek of sorts ever since I was young as a student, fascinated by these intricacies of culture and leadership. And as you said, that resulted in the career that I've had in practice, but ultimately, crazy enough, gave me the inspiration to pursue this PhD that I've defended years ago. And so I came to the topic of my doctoral work not lightly, but very intentionally after seeing my experiences in the NGO sector take shape and take form, to realize that the phenomenon of organizational culture is oftentimes so simplified and yet so misunderstood, in the sense that there are formulas and prescriptions that are published most often in the business book sections of the airport shops and things like that I have found that they oversimplify this really gray, complex reality for so many of our organizations, especially non-governmental organizations and humanitarian and development work, but also nonprofits, local nonprofits and community charities that I've been working for the entirety of my career. And so those questions really drove my curiosity, again, crazy enough to pursue a PhD and now a career as an academic, as a practitioner scholar, to use the Oxfam Haiti case as a case study. We all know that that was a crucible moment for the sector many years ago, but I think the lessons continue today for not just how do we hold ourselves accountable, but how do we really understand what, not just what went on, what went wrong per se, but how do we understand oftentimes the invisible, unconscious dynamics that are underneath the surface of so many of our organizations. They might mean well, they might be pursuing good causes as all humanitarian NGOs espouse to do, but I think to be a truly effective, if we're talking about organizational development to the best extent, we need to be looking up, down, underneath the surface, above the surface, all around to have a full scope view as to what the organization is doing. And culture is how we do that. I'm a big fan, always have been, of the work of Ed Shine.
Me too.
And so the way things are done here just always is on the back of my mind is the inspiration since I was young to understand how do organizations work, not just in the NGO world, but the corporate sector as well, the side of governments today as well. How do we understand how decisions are made, for good or for bad, how leadership is practiced, again, for good or for bad, and how do all of these questions come together to weave this cultural framework of understanding how mission-driven organizations that I've worked for and continue to support in my practice can do the best they can do, because we are in a time of world history where I would argue they're needed like never before.
They are, and at the same time, they and what they stand for is also under siege more than ever before. I do want to
That's
immediately
right.
drill down a little bit on when you said the understanding about culture is often simplified.
Mm,
Um, Tell us a little bit more about what you find particularly galling, and that's my strong, purposeful choice of a strong word, but particularly, yeah, frustrating about simple understandings of culture, the way they're portrayed in airport books, for instance.
mm. I think it's a very appreciated question. So I think we both are driven by the same curiosities and frustrations. I think um, all too often, for whatever motivations or rationales might be on the table, I think it's very easy. The temptation is very easy to find the quick answers, um, and ultimately the quick propose the quick solutions to what we think the problem is. But I would
Mhm.
take it a step back, Tosca, and say, I don't know oftentimes if we really understand the problem, the correct problem, by offering such quick fixes. And so the frustration of oversimplification and quick diagnoses, oftentimes incorrect diagnoses or incomplete diagnoses,
Right.
really is at the root cause of why I do this work, why I finished this doctoral work, but also why I continue to work with clients and students to better understand organizational life as well.
Okay. One thing that it's often that strikes me is particularly in the nonprofit and NGO sector is that culture is often understood to be referring to the organization's values, espoused values and principles and guidelines, etc. And particularly in the nonprofit sector, we tend to be, and I am critical of this, high-minded. We think we are morally virtuous, right? And you
Mm,
and I have colleagues who've worked on this. We'll
mm,
link. I have several other podcast episodes with people who've done really good work on the virtue narrative and the halo of
mm,
etc. But
mm,
we, often we practitioners tend to say, "Oh, culture, you mean our values and our belief systems, etc." And I'm often finding myself having to refer to what I really appreciate about the Neuro Leadership Institutes, for instance, where they say, "I'm not that interested actually in your espoused values. I'm more interested what are the daily practiced habits, behaviors, and
mm,
actions that are either rewarded or not rewarded in this
mm,
organization. So let's pull it down. What are the daily habits, practices, and behaviors?
Mm.
not so much the high-mindedness that is above that. How do you respond to that? And maybe I'll say one more thing. Yes, there are definitely belief systems below that, right?
Mm.
They're not always, there's sometimes a true disconnect between those real belief systems that are explaining those habits, practices, and behaviors that are encouraged or discouraged, but they're not necessarily related to what we say officially about ourselves.
You're right, and I think it's a foundational lesson that before I go on any further, let's let's just make it plain. Espouse versus lived is one thing to practice versus preach it. And I like to tell students and clients all the time, the gap between that is ever so widening in some contexts, and at risk is trust and reputation and
Yeah.
so many other things that people that is currency for living, breathing practitioners, organizations at the front lines of such important work. And so we need to really evaluate, but it's not that easy, right? Back to our last question of measuring. Culture, it naturally is not black and white per se, but it's gray. And so with that comes a whole host of metrics challenges I would offer to say, how do we really measure that appropriately and effectively? And I've got some ideas around that in terms of the NGO sector. I in my doctoral work,
Yeah.
I hearkened it really to just like you would open up your books financially to an auditor. I
Right.
would say most organizations need to reach the point where they're opening up their operations to a cultural audit, where they truly cannot understand what's going on inside without an external, non-biased, if that's possible, an external perspective to say, do you see what I see? Do you understand what I understand? Do you observe what I observe? Because so many of these cultural metrics are hidden, are maybe not said, are not as easily assessed or measured as a financial performance or an operational dashboard, like so many other aspects of our organizational life. And so there are complexities, but that doesn't mean it's not important to pursue, right? That really can be the make or break for so much of our work in organizations today if we're not truly one, diagnosing correctly what's going on in the culture, but two, calling it out, whether that be from a cultural audit or from the inside, from people to say, I'm not okay with how this work is done, or we're not really living this value that we keep saying we do. So what can we do to improve and be better?
Yeah, although there's also the reality is that most organizations also have some values that are in competition with each other, right? Or at least
Mm,
direct tension. And that,
mm,
like we know about ethics, ethics is often about how do I behave as a employee, manager, leader, whatever, board member, when I have ethical dilemmas to deal with, right?
mm, mm,
So anyway, I'm tempted now to go into the area of metrics, but let's first stick to the basics. You decided in your dissertation to use the uh, funny that I bring this up now, competing values framework of
mm,
Cameron and Quinn. Without getting academic about, let's just say it's one of the more well-known frameworks.
mhm.
Explain to our practitioner audiences who may not be familiar with what that framework entails.
Sure. So Cameron and Quinn's model, I used it deliberately. One, I think it was widely cited, so it is evidence-based. It is well regarded in the world of research, but it also very practical in the sense that it's connected to an instrument, the Organizational Culture Assessment Instrument, OCAI, which I've used with clients across the globe to some certain extent of effectiveness. It is translated well in each one of those settings. And so, in short, I would invite your listeners to just imagine an x-axis and a y-axis, these two tensions, two sets of tensions. And the y-axis would be on top this flexibility and discretion. So to the extent in which organizations are flexible and adaptable. And at
Mhm.
the other end of that is stability and control. So how stable, how secure do they feel like they need to be in control within that environment? And then from left to right on that x-axis is how internally focused are they? So what does integration look like? And then on the right side of that image in your head, external focus and what this differentiation concept look like. And so in plain language, I think this opens up a lot of good a rich conversation for organizations to reflect internally, but also invite perspectives externally as well, which I think is critically important to say, how are these competing values at play our everyday decisions that we make as leaders, as board members, as auditors, as regulators, as I argue in my doctoral work. It is as important for us to understand those tensions at play. And oftentimes they are not formulaic as we think they are, or prescriptive in approach as they might be portrayed in other business book literature, business book resources, rather. And so it produces this matrix of 4 culture types. And again, Cameron and Quinn say it's not as easy to say
Right.
that there's just 4 culture types in the world, but I'll
Yeah.
offer it to your listeners to look into if they're interested. The first is hierarchy. The second is adhocracy. The third is clan. And the fourth is market. And so again, it gives I would say practitioners and researchers alike at least a starting language to some of these conversations that we're having today
Mhm.
about what behaviors are rewarded, like you were talking about earlier, and what ways of doing business are encouraged, and how internally focused is that organization versus how adaptable and susceptible are they to external factors. And so, in a constantly evolving, changing world that we find ourselves in today, even in 2025,
Mhm.
it invites so much to think about as we think about the culture we have now and the culture that we espouse versus the one that we want in the future. And how do we have that conversation about culture change
Yeah.
effectively to diagnose where we are today and where do we want to be in the future?
For instance, to align with a new strategy or a new role that we want to.
Exactly.
So if I try to briefly and simplistically summarize those 4 typologies. So hierarchy, I think, is clear to everybody. So that's high on structure and high on
Mhm.
power differential, I imagine. Tell me if I'm wrong. Ad
And
hoc.
high on internal focused. Yep.
Okay, interesting. Yes. Uh-huh. And adhocracy is, tell me what that
Highly flexible, highly
flexible
flexible and externally focused.
and externally focused.
So
The
this is where creativity and innovation typically lies.
right, creativity and innovation. Nice. The clan is internal and familial in culture.
Yep, very much a family-oriented workplace, highly internally focused,
Yeah.
and a focus on a flexibility rather than control.
Okay. And market is again externally oriented.
Exactly. And high stability and high control.
Oh, high
So
stability.
thinking about competition, the market share, profitability, the achievement of certain goals.
Yeah, yeah. I think we're all of us who are listening, me included, are starting to just very roughly plot certain NGOs
Mm,
that we know onto these 4 typologies, right? And of course, there are lots of, as you said in the beginning, lots of gray zones. Yeah. Now, you also, Andrew, introduced in your work the concept of cultural consciousness.
mm,
Tell me about that. Did you come up with that?
mm.
Did you find that somewhere and apply it?
Sure. In my findings, again, reviewing the response to the Oxfam Haiti scandal here in the UK, looking at Parliament's response, but also the Charity Commission's response, it was very apparent that their level of cultural understanding, I argued, was not sufficient. It was very simplified. It was very um, hierarchical in approach, where something bad happened. We all know the episode of Oxfam Haiti at hand, and the calls for culture change were loud and clear. The
Yeah.
calls for new leadership was clear. And in that sense, it was fixed in some perspectives. What I argued is that the level of consciousness of regulators, of board members, people inside the organization, outside the organization, what have you, really needed to be strengthened in the sense that I argue this idea of cultural consciousness really is the intentional act of bring all that is unseen, all that is invisible, all that might not be in front of our eyes, but is going on in the culture, bringing all of that to the surface to
Mhm.
say, are we fully conscious? Like I was speaking earlier about how we make our decisions, about who is in our boardrooms, about who makes up the majority of our office leadership teams around the world. And so all of those factors and so much more, I will say, we could talk about this for hours, I'm sure, comes
Mhm.
together to this idea of cultural consciousness. And that's my goal ultimately, not just with my research, but my practice, is to ask the right questions that encourages people to think fully, to think in the most conscious way possible about their own organizational culture, their own role in that culture, the subcultures. There is no such thing as just one culture at play, right? And asking the right questions to elicit the needed answers to achieve full cultural consciousness in light of so many needed debates and dialogues today, not just across the humanitarian sector, but across the social sector and civil society at large.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I see. Are you also saying, maybe I misunderstood it when I read your parts of your dissertation and also the way it was framed in the abstract. Are you saying that the UK regulatory agencies that responded to the Oxfam Haiti crisis also assumed that you could change culture in a top-down way? Is that what you also mean by hierarchical?
Yes, and I would say introduce another phrase, not just top down in terms of a hierarchy and organizational chart, but their orientation, I argued, was policy and procedure. So that was the prescription. If there's an uncertain episode, this bad thing happened, wrongdoing took place in the organization, the answer to fix it is put in policy and procedure, have high control and high internal focus, and then the culture will be fixed. That is one approach, but I would argue in a fully conscious understanding of how these organizations work, we need to look beyond just hierarchy. Does that help?
Yes, that does help. Yeah, and I liked how you tied it back to the competing values framework and saying
Mm,
these instruments, these are not just technocratic, as you argue in your
mm,
dissertation, but they also reflect this belief system that we have high control and that we need to be highly internally focused to fix this. And then you developed a four-part model on culture. Um, and it says that A, I'm just listing them and then I'm going to ask you to explore them. Organizations have culture. Two, organizations are cultures. Three, cultures make sense of reality. And four, culture is reality. Um, Tell us more about it. They're intriguing.
thank you. I'd be happy to. So my inspiration for pursuing my doctoral work really was to deliver a contribution for practitioners, having worked in the sector. So I sought here to build on Cameron and Quinn's framework, which was the inspiration here, but in a practical sense to understand how can we reach a point of fully conscious organizations that are understanding what's going on in their cultures. So phase one, as you mentioned, Tosca, I call organizations have culture. And in the plainest of language, this is where we believe that technical fixes and prescriptive solutions, that's the answer. So if organizations have culture, if we do this one thing and we practice this other intervention, then after something happens in a wrongdoing sense, we're fixed. And so at the heart here of organizations having culture, it is really focus on fixing what has gone wrong and moving towards the future, into an idealized future where we fix the weak point and we can just isolate out the organization from the culture.
Mm.
I would argue moving on, again, the model moves to a kind of enhanced culture. So it's a developmental model if people imagine that in their heads. Phase two would identify a little bit stronger consciousness that organizations are culture. So this is where there's a wider recognition of dynamics at play within the institutional landscape. So we know humanitarian NGOs are talking about a lot of different really important dialogues and debates right now across the aid sector. There's some common cultures across, but there's no such thing as one monolithic way to have an NGO culture, right? And so movements like we've seen hashtag aid2, hashtag shift the power have really opened up some conversations across a larger swath of organizations, things around the demographic makeups of leadership teams and boards, and how do those perform at their best, but also where are these organizations located in the globe? And so that is of understanding.
Right.
So phase three, moving on, shifting even further, is focusing on how do we make sense of reality. So we have all of our espoused values, we have what's happening in the culture. How do we make sense of what's going on? Not that there's just one reality per se,
Mm.
but understanding that culture is naturally dynamic. It's not static. It is not written down in stone per se, as we oftentimes think
Right.
incorrectly that it is. And so the reality is not yet clearly defined, and yet we move forward to ask some important questions like which reality does the org culture make sense of? Or which reality is it just not unable to make sense of? And that's okay too. It's really important to understand the limits and the boundaries of what's going on in that culture if we're fully conscious and understanding good regulation and good oversight and good governance for NGOs and social sector organizations today. I think it's applicable. And then finally, the fourth step is understanding if we're fully conscious of what's going on in an organization's culture. I would argue we can see that culture is reality. And so I use this phrase naming and claiming of all of the unconscious dynamics, like I was speaking about earlier, bringing those to the surface and how understanding how they shape the present and the future to change the norms, approaches, models to leadership, to governance, to ultimately service delivery, right? And operations for all of these civil society organizations, NGOs or not, and how effective they are. And so this is emblematic, really, I think, to the current changing landscape of organizations, even in 2025 with so much volatility. How can we understand even better at the root core of these unconscious dynamics what's going on?
Yeah.
Ultimately, I would say it helps us do better in our work to fulfill our missions.
So I'm gonna, in the moment, pivot here but also build on what you just said. So we're living in 2025, as you said, extreme volatility, enormous pressure downwards on revenue, right? At least for global North founded INGOs, and thereby, given that bilateral funding has gone down so much, at least in Europe, in almost all of Europe, plus in the US, obviously. As NGOs now have to radically revise. I'm hoping that they start with revising their roles, but that's for another time to talk about, but at least revise their size, right? Their operating model, their structure, etc. In that period of radical threat and change, how the hell are we still going? How are we going to pay attention to culture, what we want to move towards now in this new environment? I know it's a hard question, but I feel I have to ask it in this year.
You're right. It's a critically important question. And I think, oddly enough, in such really difficult, challenging times that I know both of us are experienced dear colleagues and friends that are on the front lines of this work. This is their life's work.
My
And
work
so it's
impacted. So
absolutely. And so it is without doubt a significant challenge. And yet we know this is not new. This has happened before in different shapes and forms. And so I don't want to pretend that this is a new phenomenon or a new concept per se. But I think amidst all of that deep disappointment and deep upheaval that we see that is impacting people and ultimately causing lives to be lost across the globe to the people that are served.
yes,
And yet, I think that there is a really great opportunity for us to think in new, innovative ways in light of the systemic upheaval. How do some of these organizational models, how do some of these leadership approaches meet the moment of funding precarity, of political upheaval, of all of these dynamics? I would argue that in the face of such uncertainty, where we know, as I found in my dissertation, where we crave predictability and control,
As human.
we can go to Cameron and Quinn's model again, simply as a framework to start. We can go to the other end of the model and say, where can innovation happen? Where can we be encouraging NGOs? Where can we encourage local nonprofits, local charities that are on the front lines of service delivery and causing positive change?
Mhm.
How can we inspire innovative ideas that we are not thinking about in a shared, localized manner, of course, that is indigenous, that is feminist in approach, that is truly accurate to the landscape and time and place that we're living in. But I remain optimistic that hopefully we can make the most of the moment and use this idea of culture and use this way of organizational thinking to upend itself and not defer, again, back to the very top of our conversation, Tosca, not defer to the oversimplified ways of policy, procedure, control in the
Yes.
midst of very predictable uncertainty. Let's use that as fuel to innovate new thinking, new models, but also at the same time localize, buy-in, democratize learning and participation to truly live in to the espoused values and missions of these NGOs that want to be open and accessible to the people that they serve.
Yeah. My head is spinning now. um, because I'm going back to the competing values framework and thinking about the external, because in my view, NGOs are often so internally focused. And so is the extremity of this current environment, is that going to be something that culturally can make us become more externally focused or more flexibility focused, for instance, um, or not? I think the jury, it's too early, obviously, and the jury
Mm.
is still very much out. But I'm starting to muse too much. So let me go back to a concrete question or two. Um, Something that I wanted to ask is, you link it in your dissertation, cultural consciousness, also to power and leadership mindsets. Can you talk to us about that?
I think the opportunity presents itself really clearly to understand as leaders, as board members, as regulators, that the moment continues to evolve and shift towards a more equal, justice-minded approach to humanitarian aid, international development, and I would argue civil society more broadly,
Mm.
where we no longer are in an age where people and power can be left unaccountable, where there are cultural and systemic forces at play. We've just identified several of them that are just not leaving the option anymore for people to continue as normal with their business decision-making models, as well as their governance approaches. And so I practically propose this cultural audit perspective to practice. I'm still working on a couple of follow-up projects from my doctoral work that I can talk about later. But practically speaking, I think the opportunity is very present for civil society organizations more broadly to open themselves up in this time of great upheaval,
Mhm.
albeit caused by all of those factors that we've mentioned, to open themselves up fully to critics, to regulators alike, but also, I would argue, in a third sense, to this idea of innovative thinking, to ultimately think when are we going to see the mergers happen? And I know there's much more work that has been done. There is work that's been done, I should say, from scholars and practitioners alike. You've mentioned several of them already. Where ultimately, if we are going to achieve zero poverty, if we are going to achieve the end of childhood hunger, I'm excited to the potential of some of these brand name NGOs, some of these local civil society organizations, big, small, everything in between, to
Mm.
perhaps, hopefully, think in new ways about not just merging their operations, but thinking in new partnership models, new shared governance approaches where they can more clearly realign themselves to the mission that they espouse and honestly say, are we where we want to be? And if not, how can we take the most opportunity right now
Yeah.
to redeploy, to realign not just our funding, not just our people, but our overall mission? Because we have problems in the globe that are fixable. It is a political choice, right?
Mm,
In many senses. Ultimately, I think it's also a leadership choice for those in power to say, how can we adapt to the moment that we're in if we want to be effective at solving this global problem?
yeah. And purely practically, that cultural audit that you talked about, and again, in this conversation, we can't go into that type of tool per se, but I'm very curious. Um, it seems to me that if nonprofits and NGOs, given the volatility of the environment, are going to change quite significantly, doing an audit of what are the habits, practices, and behaviors and the underlying belief systems that are currently encouraged in our organization, and how do they need to shift? No, what is still helpful from that past that we want to maintain in our new identity, if you will, and what do we need to change at the
Hmm.
level of habits, practices, and behaviors that need to be
Hmm.
now extra encouraged or that can no longer be condoned, for instance. That's where my mind is going in terms of
Hmm.
that could be an incredibly helpful building block for a new
Yeah.
right organization.
Yeah, Tosca, I'd add this, and again, this is I can't take credit from this, but three questions in any kind of culture change process.
Okay.
One, what should we do more of?
Yeah. Very
Two,
simple.
what should we start?
Yeah.
And three, what should we stop?
Yeah.
Again,
That's
I
both very
cite the references,
questions.
but
Yes, yes, exactly. Those simple questions would be good, right? Because you want to get to what does it mean for our daily behaviors, right?
Mhm,
Um, yeah. Now you also talk about another thing that you and I really like, and this whole idea between the disconnect between the values that we espouse, that mean, in other words, espousing being a fancy term for that we aspire to, that we say we're all about, and the actual actual practices in humanitarian NGOs. I often call that, the disconnect between the espoused values and the real in-use habits, practices, and behaviors. Many organizations, private sector, public sector, and nonprofits face somewhat of a disconnect often, right? But in the case of nonprofits, I find that disconnect can be even more challenging to discuss, let alone do something about to address, right? I often have an experience of either avoidance of discussing the disconnect or a brittleness around it because our identity as NGO uh, workers is so strongly tied to the moral value that we think is encapsulated in that
mm.
that we become very brittle towards critiques from inside or outside, right? So why can it be even more challenging, you think, to discuss that disconnect in the case of nonprofits and NGOs?
Well, I'd invite your listeners to just think about the espoused or the, as you said, the aspired to values on one side of a page and the lived values on the other side of the page in your mind. Um, those are movable mountains, as I tell students all the time, but they're pretty significant presence, right? We see these espoused values listed on our websites, painted on our walls, talked about again and again in meetings, etc. But it's a different thing to actually see them lived out and
Yeah,
see evidence of them being lived. But I would argue that the farther that those mountains are apart, the bigger the gap is
yeah,
in between them is what I call a trust gap. And I would think that is the currency of choice these days, that once it is lost, it is really hard to get back. If you think about all of the different relationships that these organizations have, NGOs, civil society, local charities, etc., from the employees to beneficiaries, those people that they serve, whatever term you want to use that is politically correct in your context, whether it be from the senior leader to the board member, whether it be to the charity executive to the regulator of that national government, that
right.
what they practice needs to be measured so they can honestly say they're preaching it. Otherwise, that trust gap is considerable. And so I think that is a real practical, a very prescient dynamic as we think about social currency and political currency today, is that really valuable aspect of trust.
So yes, you're saying that prescriptively. Now I want to, I'm inviting you to dig a little bit more around why is it so difficult to discuss that disconnect in our sector, or do you not
Mm,
think it's extra difficult in our sector? That would be my view, but you may disagree. So
yeah. Yeah, I think a couple of things come to mind. One, I think it's never fun to talk about what's going wrong, right? We always want to save face. I don't
yeah,
care where you are in the globe or what culture you come from, nationally speaking or ethnically speaking, or whatever aspect of culture outside of the organization. No one likes to talk about what's going wrong, and yet, until we reach that moment of full understanding of full consciousness, I don't think we can truly be effective at achieving our mission
and that's
and
what
living the values that we
empathy,
do.
right? Yeah.
And so, why is it so? I think that's one aspect. Number two, I think it's not that easy, and it is not as prescriptive and formulaic as sometimes we are meant to believe. To say, okay, these are our values. What do you mean we don't measure that? And understanding that this very gray type of conversation, that being organization's culture, is not as black and white as auditing a finance book or seeing how many meal kits were distributed or how many bed nets were offered and flown into this part of the world. And yet it still warrants deep examination of, okay, you say this, but are you actually showing proof and showing evidence and living into the mission that you say you have? And so those two things, I think, one, it's not easy
Mm.
to really think critically about your internal operation, because we're talking about reputation. We're talking about these organizations' existence, and some of them multiple decades, if not a century or longer, right?
Yeah,
And so they have reputations to protect.
yeah.
And yet at the same time, it's not as easy as well. So it's really hard, but needed work to reflect, to be reviewed, to be evaluated. From all up and down, left, right, and center in an organization's chart and an organization's reach, I would say even the people that they serve, asking the question, how is this going for you? Do you see this lived out from your perspective in the most inclusive, democratized way? Until we reach that point, I don't think these missions can be fully achieved.
Yeah. And I must say, I don't like to do finger wagging. I don't think it's very useful. It doesn't work. But also, I have a lot of empathy for senior leaders who have to somehow balance competing espoused values, right?
Mm,
That are in direct tension with each other.
mm,
Because yeah, they will always be at the subject of critique, and yet
mm.
that's what the organization, including its governance and the external context and its donors and its constituents, etc., asks of them. So I always have a lot of
And
awe. Yeah, go ahead.
and I would take that a step further. Absolutely co-signed and second your emotion. I have great empathy for leaders in this moment where payrolls are driving a lot of the decisions, where doors will be left closed or opened, where
Yeah.
funding is the driving force. Um, and so it is critically important to think about the priorities in reality too. But also, I think this idea of balance sometimes I think is overglorified, right? And oversimplified in the sense that it's never fully a seesaw that is balanced in our head. I'm not a big fan of the work-life balance conversation because I think it's just not real. We have so many different lives and so many
Yeah.
different hats to wear. I think similarly in the competing values sense, those tensions are not the same from one
No.
organization to the next. And yet they need to understand what is the most urgent priority right now is to
Yeah.
make sure I have my people and to make sure we can continue to keep our doors open. I don't want to gloss over that, and I know you don't either. And yet it goes without saying that these tensions, I think, are oftentimes over intellectualized, when in reality, the practical needs that drive both your work and my work really are at the heart and core of driving decisions today.
How can they not, right? So moving towards the end of the interview, I'd love to hear you talk, Andrew, for a few minutes about for when we think about culture change, what are the practical levers that middle managers and senior leaders, and not so much think about governance now or governors,
Mm,
but those two groups have to change culture. We won't talk about the time frame. I find often people are unrealistic or naive about how long it takes, right?
mm,
But let's not go there. Just what do you think have you seen in the nonprofit and NGO context to be the most effective practical levers for culture change?
mm. What a great question, Tosca. And you're right. The time scale is really important to keep in check because it is so ambiguous in some sense and yet so unrealistic in others. So I so appreciate the question. A couple of thoughts come to mind
Yeah.
for our colleagues who are listening and wondering, how do I do that here?
Yes,
One is just the practical day-to-day behaviors. I'll go back to those three questions that I asked earlier. What do you want to see more of?
I like
What do
that.
you want to start and what do you want to stop? As you think about your own lived experience as a manager, as a department head, whatever hat that you wear, doing that internal reflection first is incredibly important before you ask that of your people and ask that of your team. Second, I would look at rituals and routines. What are things that are happening on a regular or semi-regular basis in your office, in your department, virtual or in person? And are they helpful? Are they effective at
Mhm.
meeting your strategy and meeting your mission? If the answer is no, I would wager guess that those things can be stopped. And
Mm,
yet I would invite your team and those colleagues around you to say, what routines and rhythms do we want to begin? What
yeah,
rituals do we want to start that
yeah,
could help live out the culture that we want to see into the future? And so I would say whenever we can look in a 360 sense,
yeah.
not necessarily in a 360 evaluation, because I think that ritual of HR speak is not always effective. And is weaponized, unfortunately, today. But if we truly think in a fully conscious, holistic way, how can we get buy-in and get input from
Mhm.
not just ourselves, but those around us, and a practical sense of behaviors and rituals? I think that is a first step to take towards practical culture change in the smallest sense of the word right now in today's organizations.
Interesting. Yeah, and the second one, rituals and routines. It's interesting. Um, I think it's one of the levers that is least thought about.
I
So
agree.
when I do senior leadership training in the past or in the present, that element is often kind of overlooked. So I'm glad I mentioned that, right? Similarly to stories or what symbols do we use, right? That's very closely aligned with rituals. But what do our rituals say about do our rituals reflect our aspired culture and where we, especially if we need to change, where we need to go, versus do they reflect something that we used to be? And the thing always to keep in mind is culture is incredibly tenacious, right? For a reason. It worked for the organization for a long time. It just doesn't work anymore now. So being really conscious about what rituals and routines, what stories, what pictures, what images, etc., are reflecting where we want to go rather than where we once were. So that I'm totally with you on that. All right, we need to bring this to a close. So Andrew, after this wide-ranging discussion, people must often will say, okay, I want to know more about what this person is talking about. You're on Substack now. You have written in other public places about the aftermath of your dissertation. Where should people find you?
Sure. The best place to find me is on LinkedIn, first of all, Andrew Henck, Henck, where I am actively thinking and writing about many of these issues and other things around leadership and culture from a pracademic sense.
Yeah.
So to speak, but also my Substack as well as a new outlet that I've used that I really enjoyed. It's called Context Change. And as I tell my students and my clients all the time, we can practice some of these leadership styles and organizational approaches, but they will only be effective if we truly understand the context that we're in. And so we need to be conscious and aware of the physical context, but also the cultural context that are happening around us to really be effective at the missions that we espouse and the leadership that we try to achieve for the sake of the world. So that's where they can that's where your listeners can check in and learn more.
Okay, we will put both these links in the show notes for sure, and I'll be sure to start following you on Substack. That is because you now make me curious. I want to hear you talk more about cultural audits and the how and what of that, for instance. So I look forward to that. So with that, thank you, Andrew, for all your insights. It's been fascinating, and I hope others will find it stimulating as well. Be sure to check out our other episodes on culture in our nonprofit sector, the podcast episodes. We have episodes with thinkers who have written and talked about the halo effect, for instance, in the culture of NGOs, the virtue narrative, and the fact that these things sometimes actually can have negative impacts on the organization's effectiveness, but also on their wrongdoing, etc. And by the way, listeners, did you know that my YouTube channel also offers the podcast videos as well? Check it out. I also want to give a shout out one last time to my colleague Tori Peace. She is the host of another podcast well worth your time. It's called The Modern Humanitarian and Development Leader. And I will put that show note also, that link also in the show notes. So you can, if you are interested, listen to her podcast. Everybody, this is a time of profound and very difficult, I would say, shock change for many of us. If you've wanted to receive some advice from a person like myself, but you do not have the budget right now or the time to engage in a longer consultation process or coaching process, there is an opportunity on my website to sign up for a one-off advisory call directly through my website, and that is fiveoaksconsulting.org. With that, I'm going to say goodbye to us all and see you next time on NGO Soul and Strategy.